Hi, my name's Rachel Saunders. Welcome to the Lavender and Still podcast. Today, I have got the great pleasure of introducing Melissa D, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Loving Me, England's first trans and non-binary domestic abuse service. Today, we're going to be talking about Cast Out, their report looking at trans and non-binary people's experiences of domestic abuse. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there. My name's Melissa D, and like I said, I'm COO of Loving Me. We operate the UK's first domestic abuse refuge by and for the trans and non-binary community. We also offer trans-inclusive practice training to professionals. We did previously run the UK's first national outreach service specifically by and for the trans and non-binary community. We did have to stop that due to a lack of funding. However, a lot of that work is reflected on the research that we've just released. And excitingly, we have just appointed somebody to do outreach work with 18 to 25-year-olds in the Northwest region specifically. So we will be able to be doing some outreach work again.
Fantastic. That's really good news to hear. So going through the report, one of the things that was really interesting for me is you've identified what you call identity-based abuse as a distinct form of abuse that isn't recognised under the UK's Domestic Abuse Act 2021. So how would you frame that, and how would you unpack that?
So the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 gives a statutory definition of abuse. And of course, it doesn't recognise identity-based abuse in that. Now, what we found is just under 70% of people using our service experience what we would classify as identity-based abuse. And of course, being trans people, that's something that we feel is hardly surprising recently, really, because of course, a person's being trans is often the focus and target of abuse. Now, in the report, we do sort of lay out quite a fleshed out definition of what we think identity-based abuse might look like. But what we're really talking about here is the factors where somebody is taking somebody's identity and using that as the basis of the abuse which is perpetrated against somebody. So that might include things like restricting, in terms of trans people, restricting access to gender affirming healthcare. It might include things like forbidding somebody to present how they wish to present. Of course, it would include things like systematic dead naming and misgendering. Now, I think as trans people generally, unfortunately, we all tend to have experienced, things around our identity that we would find quite familiar in terms of how people treat us and try to suppress our identity. And of course, if you're in a situation where this is being systematically weaponized against you, this can have very harmful consequences, but it's not stuff that's always recognized by people. Now, of course, this can get into quite serious terrain in terms of whether that, if that might sort of escalate into sort of physical or sexual abuse based on trying to suppress somebody's identity. And of course, there's a big potential linkage there with conversion practices, because that's often about trying to suppress who somebody is, or to, basically try and stop them from being trans. But one of the things that we've found quite often in our work is that say you've got somebody that's having, in quite an abusive situation, and so they approach a local authority trying to access emergency housing or something like that. And some of the stuff that they might be talking about is that their identity is just not being recognised. So they are being, routinely dead named. They are being routinely misgendered. They can't access the healthcare that they need. They're not allowed to present how they want to present. Quite often, staff that may have no real knowledge or insight into the trans community, and of course we're all aware of the hostile climate that we exist in the UK currently. It's very easy for people to underestimate that stuff, and very easy for people not to understand the psychological impact some of that stuff has on people.
Exactly, and I think this is really important to draw out, because ultimately, if you're surviving abuse, you don't want to have to defend your identity every step of the way. You don't want to have to tell every single person you touch in the process your entire backstory. You just want to be treated with dignity and respect in order to be able to get the support and help you need.
Absolutely. And it's also about not having to try and explain to somebody that actually somebody attacking your identity fundamentally or basing abuse on your identity, why that's a bad thing or why that has sort of a bad effect on you. And I think something as well that it's important to highlight here, of course, this isn't the concept of identity-based abuse isn't specifically about trans people. So that can be about other groups where, somebody's identity is attacked or weaponized against them. But of course, within each community, there are going to be sort of peculiar facets to that, if that makes sense. For our community at the moment, there is this sense that there is this incredibly hostile climate towards us in the UK currently, where unfortunately a lot of the stuff that about rejecting trans people's identities and not accepting us for who we are is actually relatively mainstreamed, and that does create big problems. Particularly because we also found that just over 60% of people accessing our service experience familial abuse, and of course one of the big problems at the moment is that if you come out as trans to your family and people, oh God, what's this about kind of thing, that people can very easily go online and be finding all kinds of awful stuff about that. Do you know what I mean? So unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff that's going on at the moment that's fueling this antipathy towards our identity.
I agree, and I think it's interesting when you have organisations such as the Bayswater groups who are being run by parents who are explicitly seeking to deny their children's identities. Now, obviously, we can't go into too much detail about that, but it's telling that when you see the court cases, the highly public nature of the conversation around trans identity, especially with younger trans people, you've got this familial setting which is not safe for trans people to just exist as themselves. And it's in the report, you talk about how the vast majority of people who are abusing trans people are cisgender. And it's something like 98.2%. And there's a roughly even split between cis female and cis male abuse of trans people. This isn't something which is one group or another that is targeting trans people. It seems to be that the survivors of this abuse are receiving it from a space that should be a safe environment for them to be able to explore and affirm their identity rather than being exposed to abuse and denial of their identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, and it's important to sort of recognise with that often, from this sort of premise of not, of not accepting somebody's identity, that then we see this sort of continual escalation, into the realms of kind of systematic abuse in terms of that can get into, because if you want to suppress somebody's identity, and that can get into territory like, okay, maybe the people you're around are having a negative influence on you on this. Maybe they're kind of transing you in some way. So you better not go out. You better not speak to people. Better look at what you're looking at on the internet, kind of thing. Better sort of control your money. So then this can get into these sort of mechanisms of really trying to control somebody's life. And again, like I say, that sometimes this can escalate into sometimes, for example, sort of physical abuse. But yeah, I think it's very much about the place where you are supposed to be most safe becoming sort of somewhere really hostile. And then this can have a knock-on effect as well. I think it's really important to recognise, because then, of course, you're in a situation where the people that you're supposed to turn to are no longer there for you. And one of the things that I think is, which I think is really quite tragic, actually, that in terms of a lot of the people that have accessed our service, it's actually more the norm for people to have either disowned or been disowned by their families than to have a supportive family. And that's often in the case of people that might be experiencing intimate partner abuse kind of thing. So you can also get this dynamic where, because somebody can't accept somebody for being trans, then that person has to get out of that situation. And then, of course, is very vulnerable, and then is potentially vulnerable to other forms of abuse because that person's, trying to find other people to sort of, care and support for them, kind of thing. So it creates this kind of cycle of vulnerability. And also that there's something about that, I think, which is, and I think it could be interesting to know the exact scale of the issue here, of the amount of people that are drifting around in, insecure housing and in a very insecure position because they've had to get out of that family situation.
Yeah, and I think this is, as a trans woman myself who's experienced near homelessness. Thankfully I've never been homeless, but there have been occasions where it's become a distinct possibility, especially when I was younger, is that when you transition, you open yourself up and you need reciprocity from others. And if you don't find that reciprocity, or you face hostility over your identity, you end up becoming very, very vulnerable. And especially when you haven't been given the tools about how to navigate society yet, or you haven't got a network of friends or other family members you can fall back on, that leaves you in a really horrific situation. And I know from other evidence, especially in America, that a lot of the work done by trans charities and organizations over in the States have pointed out that trans people, that homelessness rates amongst the trans community, especially in areas which are very hostile to trans people, is significantly higher than in areas where trans inclusion and trans pluralism has been accepted. And reading again, another thing that's coming out of the report is that you've said that specialist services by and for trans people that are run by trans people and trans and non-binary people is seen as a way of reducing the harms caused by that abuse. And it's really interesting seeing that peer support mechanism coming through.
I think there's a sort of tension in that to some degree, in the sense that, I suppose, because we're keen to advocate for specialist services, but that always has to come with the caveat that we think that anybody should be able to approach local services and get a decent service. So there's always the risk with specialist services that trans people can get, you go and do your own thing over here, kind of thing. But the blunt fact with that is that it is really important to have kind of specialist services there for people. And the thing is as well, that then you don't have to worry about, there's obviously a service run by trans people kind of understands transness. Do you know what I mean? And if you're around other trans people, all that stuff, you just don't have to worry about all that element of things, really, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it makes complete sense. And it's telling that in the report as well, you're saying about 84.4% of your clients were under the age of 34. That's really concerning when it comes to signs of abuse, because obviously we don't want anyone to suffer from abuse. But the fact that so many young people are fleeing abuse shows that it's shocking in many respects, because it's like, these are the people who should be getting opportunities of their life. They should be given the space to affirm and exist as themselves, and yet they're being subjected to abuse which is causing them significant long-term harm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think it is a really sort of shocking figure. And again, I think that a lot of this reflects the prevalence of kind of familial abuse, which then is pushing a lot of these young trans people into a situation where they're trying to, that they need to get out of. And I think another aspect to this that comes into it as well is that, of course, that housing is so difficult at the moment. So it's not straightforward for people to extricate themselves from these situations. I remember when, because I'm clocking on a bit now. When I was younger, it felt like it was a lot more of a viable thing to be able to go and, secure accommodation in the private sector that you could get, and that you could, they would accept benefits and benefits would cover. There just seemed to be a lot more options in terms of available housing. And it seems like the housing situation now for people is incredibly difficult. So where I think, young queer people in general need to get out of situations, it's incredibly hard for them to sort of find anywhere to go as well. And I think that exacerbates the situation quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's very noticeable since 2010 when the Conservative government started their austerity drive. There's been this great demonization of the young.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's like I'm 44 and I've lived through tail end of Margaret Thatcher's, John Major's, Tony Blair's, Gordon Brown's, David Cameron's, etc. And it's like the thing that stands out when they say that young people are a problem in need of austerity solutions is like young people have overwhelming issues that the society we're building isn't built to solve. Like the next statistic that the report raises is that only 25% of your clients have actually found some form of employment prior to using your services. And it's like, if that's the case, that shows that 75% of trans people are struggling. And
Well, I think that, because I think the thing is I think there's actually kind of a much broader issue here that it taps into about the vulnerability of trans people and what people are going through. So like, okay, so, you know, we run a refuge service, and that's very specifically for, you know, domestic abuse kind of thing. And of course, a refuge is a very specific kind of accommodation. It's not appropriate for anyone. There's, you know, refuges are built to be able to safely accommodate people that might be very high risk. You know, it's a secret location, for example. You know, there's kind of quite a lot of rules to keep it safe kind of thing. And I think beneath that threshold of outright abuse as well, there's a completely unknown quantity of very vulnerable, I suppose, queer young people that are really struggling to find somewhere to go and really struggling to find employment and really struggling to find kind of any place. And as the situation has got more and more challenging for us, then I think I just personally think there's a whole other layer underneath that of people that are just being cast into the margins. And of course, that with the effect of the Supreme Court judgment as well, with, you mentioned that, you know, quite a high rate of people have had no employment. Of course, it's going to be more and more difficult now for us to find employment as the chilling effect of the HRC code then gets translated into workplaces, even though we know it doesn't technically apply there, but we also know that it's starting to be adopted in that kind of setting. So of course, a lot of employers are going to maybe start asking themselves, well, is it really worth us employing trans people? Do you know what I mean? So it's a bit of a mess, isn't it?
I agree. And I think this is where you get the texture between what the For Women Scotland ruling said, what the HRC guidance is laying out, and then the practical reality for everybody. And I'm seeing this in the job market. Is I finished my PhD last year. I've only been able to pick up a few temporary contracts that thankfully have been able to pay the bills, but they haven't been able to cover much else. And this is I'm somebody who people will consider highly educated. Now, I don't think any of this is to do with me being trans, but once I do re-enter the workplace, I've got to face up to those sort of conversations where do I, as a trans person, become very discreet with my identity and leave it off the table? Or do I out myself to HR to say, well, potentially there could be a problem here? Now, personally, I'd prefer the discreet version of myself because I don't necessarily want to be in an environment where my body is political every moment of every day. But not every trans person has the opportunity to do that, especially when they're just coming out, or if you're in employment or you're in an environment where people know who you are and you know what your past was. And it's telling that in your recommendations, one of the things you've been calling for is improved data collection about trans identities. Now, if the HRC guidance is going, you've got to bar trans people from single-sex spaces, there could be a tension set up between the need for better data collection and trans people's desire to fly under the radar.
No, I think that's a really valid point. And I think it is a sort of, again, it presents a sort of another big problem, because obviously what we kind of need is for the needs of trans people to be recognised and for the needs of trans people to be accommodated. And there is an absolutely woeful lack of data over time about trans people's experiences of abuse and about the kinds of abuse that trans people are experiencing. But you're absolutely right that over time, we know historically that the way trans people used to negotiate society a lot of the time was by stealth. Because obviously, if you're in a very unsafe situation, if you know you're going to be discriminated against because you're trans, well, why would you tell somebody that you're trans, kind of thing? And I think that there is a real danger of trans people sort of being pushed away from being honest about stuff. And there's also the other element that comes with that, with stuff that comes on the back of like the Sullivan Review and stuff, because where services are being pushed to record data in terms of so-called biological sex, that then potentially erases trans people as well by doing that. But of course, it's either way, it's a big problem if trans people are pushed out of data, because then what's all right? Well, there aren't any of those people, so we don't need to worry about them. So it's very important that we're there, but it's also becoming more unsafe for us to be there.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And then you're arguing for clear guidance on lawful implementation of inclusion, which draws that whole point out. It's like, how do you include people who feel unsafe by coming out? If you're setting up I'm not going to call it a benignly hostile environment, but a hostile environment because people feel it's going to be hostile, irrespective of whether or not people are going to be hostile.
Yeah.
So if the general rule in society is the moment you out yourself is the moment you lose access, irrespective of who you are, that sets up an environment where to be publicly trans is to invite state mandated hostility towards your identity. And it's, as you said about the implementation side, that the government and regulators really do need to work with trans inclusive organizations, because otherwise all you're doing is just saying, well, actually, how do we support a group of people that is basically the moment they out themselves is the moment they're segregated. And I find that a really interesting point that you raised.
And I think that, and because the thing is that then it, and what it means is that trans people are doomed to a sort of substandard service, because of course, as we know in the previous situation, trans people could be excluded from single-sex spaces if it was a proportionate means to a legitimate aim. So in the domestic abuse sector, how that translated is that some services were trans exclusive, and they could they were on quite a firm legal footing for doing that. Other services were very vocally trans inclusive. So the situation was there was always fewer services that were appropriate for trans people to be accessing, but there was that provision there. And we, in terms of training that we've done, tried to do quite a lot of work to try and help services that wish to be more inclusive for trans people. Now we're entering a situation where services are being told, you have to be, you have to be trans exclusive, whether you want to or not, in terms of single sex spaces. Now, there is a lot of nuance here because, of course, a lot of services are commissioned to be services for men and women, kind of thing. So you can't realistically ban trans people from services that for both men and women. But then it's where people are placed within those services, if that makes sense. So you can then have situations where you've got a service that, okay, well, we work with everybody. So trans person, we're going to work with you. But you might find that, well, you're a trans woman, well, you can't go to our women's groups, kind of thing. So that then trans people will get a service, but they might not get the full service. And so they might find that they're getting a lesser service than cisgender people might be able to access. And also, like in terms of safe accommodation. So, of course, with all this stuff about single-sex spaces, if you've got a women's refuge that is for women, now they're being told that you cannot accommodate a trans woman and call yourself women's service kind of thing, whether, so it's forcing that. Now, there are quite a lot of domestic abuse services who offer dispersed accommodation, so single units kind of thing. That accommodation provision, there's not as much of that. So there are some services that are, that are really committed to being like, to Refuge, for example, who are committed to being trans inclusive. But in order to comply with, the statutory code, trans people will get placed in dispersed units, of which there are less. That means, in terms of available refuge accommodation, there is just a lot less for trans people, and they're having to compete with other people that might need dispersed accommodation, like people with families. Often that's the only accommodation that men might be able to access, because there's far fewer men accessing safe accommodation. So it just puts trans people at a strong disadvantage. And of course, in some areas might mean that they can't access something when they need it.
Exactly. And I think it comes on to your next point about investing in specialist buy and for services, because when we talk about domestic abuse accommodation, it became such a flashpoint over the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre. And obviously you can't be drawn out because you're a charity on the specifics. But one of the fundamental attack points on trans women specifically has been that gender critics have used women's shelters as the entry point into denying trans women specifically their identities. Now, what was telling about the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre is that it was actually the defence of a non-binary employee that led to that situation blowing up. And this is often what gets left out of the conversation, is that when we talk about trans inclusive spaces, we're also talking about non-binary people.
No, I'm glad that you've mentioned that, because of course non-binary people have struggled tremendously for well, I mean, this was already sort of the state of play for non-binary people before that, because of course, if you've got a men's refuge or a woman's refuge, if you're a non-binary person, you've traditionally had to, before the Supreme Court judgment, you had to kind of think, well, which do I fit best in, kind of thing. Although there has always, again, been that smaller pool of sort of dispersed accommodation. But of course, yeah, for non-binary people negotiating essentially gendered systems, it's always been phenomenally difficult. But of course, that then we get into this whole thing that non-binary people just have never had proper recognition in this country at all.
Yeah, exactly. And after Christie Allen Cain's failure at the UK Supreme Court, the government still haven't introduced protections for non-binary people. And one of the things that I think is really important for listeners to appreciate is that, unlike a country like Germany, which recognises third sex, there is no domestic UK legal protection in any of the constituent parts of the UK that says that non-binary people have to have their identity validated either by employees or by services, meaning that after the UK Supreme Court ruling was passed down, essentially there's going to be denial of their identity at every single touch point. And as a binary person myself, it's like one of the causes I'm really passionate about is being a non-binary ally, because non-binary people face so many problems having to navigate binary spaces that essentially I want to get out of their way and actually advocate for them on their own terms. And as was pointed out to me a few months ago, non-binary identities are not they're not trans, but they're also not cisgender. There is this constellation of identity. They're like a nebula. And it's not just going, oh, that's a non-binary person and that's not a non-binary person. Non-binary identities are as complex as the individuals themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
So, yeah.
And I mean, the thing that I find kind of ironic in all this is that the UK has been so determined not to recognise non-binary people. But when it comes to binary trans people, they're quite happy to third sex us, kind of thing. And you can go and use a gender neutral toilet. So we're gonna make binary trans people we're gonna put them in a third category quite happily. But the people that exist in a category outside the binary, oh no, we don't recognise you.
No, exactly. And then that leads on to the conversation about access to safe accommodation, because how do you navigate the challenges for providing access to accommodation for abuse survivors, where their very identity is being the thing that's attacked? As we raised at the beginning, it's like if identity abuse is a reason why people are fleeing, how are you supposed to navigate a system where your very identity is being abused at every single touch point, willingly or unwittingly or willingly? It's like if a domestic abuse shelter is having to sex you based on assumptions, that could be compounding the abuse that you're suffering.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's, and that has been kind of an issue for a long time. I think that therefore, and obviously that there is there a definite place for having provision, which is basically saying, well, we just accept you for whoever you are. And that doesn't really matter, kind of thing. And who you are in that situation is fully supported.
Exactly. And another key point you've raised is about strengthening the workforce within the sector and actually going, how can we help people who are supporting trans victims of domestic abuse? So you're arguing things like understanding identity-based abuse. I would say that's foundational. That has to be something which all domestic abuse survivors, irrespective if they're dealing with trans people, because you could well have Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu women who are facing issues. You could have domestic abuse survivors from different ethnic backgrounds. You could have disabled abuse survivors, and you talk about intersectionality throughout the report. And so understanding somebody's identity and whether or not that has been weaponized against them in an abuse setting is, I would say, foundational. It's got to be a part of any core training.
And I think that, it mentioned because again, the other additional challenges that come into it, I think it's, I'm just trying to remember the figure off the top of my head, but I think that the figure for people who are non-white in terms of people that access our service is actually a little bit higher than what you would sort of get in the general proportion of the population. And of course that there are, like, say, for example, that you get a trans person who is an asylum seeker who has no recourse to public funds. Now, in terms of provision for people in that kind of position, that's already very difficult. And then you layer transness on top of that, and it becomes a really difficult situation for people. But in terms of, and in terms of an appreciation of workers in the sector as well, I think the thing that it comes back to as well, I think, really, is that of course, every single survivor, every single person who needs support is an individual person, and that person is important. And, we all need to be able to have our needs met, right? But of course, at the same time, all this furore about trans people and whatever, numerically, we are a very small population. There isn't that many of us. And there's a couple of factors that come out in this. One thing that I did want to mention with, and it made me think with some of the stuff you were saying earlier, particularly, say, in terms of trans women in women's services, something that always strikes me a bit strange is that trans women in women's services, we're always portrayed as barging into women's spaces, you know what I mean, and being threatening and all this kind of stuff. And the thing is if you're a trans woman accessing a woman's service, if you're probably the only trans woman there surrounded by cis women, you're actually quite vulnerable in that situation. You're the person that's different there. Do you know what I mean? That you kind of, you've often, you might feel like the outsider kind of thing. And so I think that people don't, because of all this rhetoric presenting trans people as a threat, and of course the converse is the same for trans masculine people in men's spaces, that we tend to have been framed as the outsider, and it tends to be us that are very vulnerable in these situations because we're the only person there who's like us. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
And numerically, we are quite a small population. And of course, a lot of services that want to work very inclusively, well, people might not, you can't blame cis people for maybe not knowing much about trans people or having had contact with trans people. For a lot of people, they haven't really had reason to think about us very much. Do you know what I mean? So there is a lot of work to be done to upskill people in working for us. But in order for that to take place as well, services need to be able to work with us inclusively. And it's an enormous problem that they're now being told that they can't.
No, I agree. And this comes on to another point you've raised in the report, that actually it's important to recognise the additional barriers experienced by trans and non-binary survivors, and going, actually, what do they need in order to get through the horrific experiences they're suffering.
And because there's also the bit that we haven't touched on yet, is that there's all the pragmatic stuff that comes with that, some of which is actually really difficult. So often for a lot of trans survivors, that again, particularly in a familial situation, you might be been very rigidly controlled into what you can do. People often haven't been able to change their name. People have often got no documents reflecting who they are, kind of thing. So that whole process that we all go through of changing everything, quite often that hasn't even been started, or it might be sort of, bits of in one name, bits in another name, kind of stuff. All that sort of practical stuff often hasn't been done, and often people haven't had the chance to sort of think about how they go about that. The other really big problem, which unfortunately it's really difficult to think of really hard for us to have a solution to, is healthcare, of course, because again, particularly young trans adults from a very abusive familial background, well, it's hard enough as it is for us to access healthcare, right? The bit that really breaks my heart is where you've got somebody who's a young adult and they finally get out of that situation and they're finally free to be who they are. Well, all you can really do is put somebody on a waiting list. Do you know what I mean? So the lack of healthcare, I think, is an enormous problem.
So that actually then raises an interesting question. What is the process if someone's going through an abusive situation where they're seeking help? Because this is something which, when we talk about domestic abuse survivors and the services available to them, it always appears to be in the abstract. So I think it'll be, if you're able to, what is the process from if someone's seeking help, what is the process that they would go through?
Well, I suppose really that, I suppose it kind of depends on the situation. And I think it depends on so if somebody's looking to get out of a situation, there's a couple of different routes that people can go down potentially. So the first thing that I think it's important for somebody to reach out for support and advocacy, and there are some organisations doing really good work around this. So in terms of, so there's Galop, who do LGBT domestic abuse outreach work, and they're national, and anyone can contact them from around the country. There's AKT, the Albert Kennedy Trust, that offer housing advice for under 25s. They're really good. There are other sort of services dotted around the country, so Stonewall Housing, that offer housing based in the south. There's the Outside Project in London that have an LGBT refuge. In Cheshire, there's a really good service, Trans Without Abuse. So there's stuff sort of dotted around. So it's really important for people to try and engage with some sort of support and advocacy, to look, because it's based on your specific situation and kind of what you want to do in that situation. Now, one thing that is really important for people to be aware of is, if you are a victim of domestic abuse, your local authority has a statutory obligation to offer you emergency housing. And the local authority shouldn't expect you to evidence that, to be able to sort of prove in some sort of concrete way, because obviously how can you do that, sort of, particularly where the pitfalls are with that is that familial abuse specifically is under-recognised generally, even outside of trans people. And of course, often people that work for local authorities often don't have a very good understanding of trans people, kind of thing. So again, if you're in that sort of situation, it's really important to reach out to a service like Galop or AKT who can support you, because the risk for trans people is particularly survivors of domestic abuse. In theory, you can rock up to your local housing department and say, I have fled domestic abuse. Please, can you offer me emergency accommodation, kind of thing. In theory, you can do that. But if with trans people experiencing familial abuse, sometimes they can get, well, that's family breakdown, like you just need to go home, go and sort it out, kind of thing. So it's really important to have somebody to advocate around that. And of course, as a trans person, there's a risk associated to that strategy in terms of the emergency accommodation can be pretty much anywhere. So there's a risk that you might get put in shared accommodation with the wrong gender, kind of thing. So there's a lot of difficulty attached to that kind of situation. So there is also the kind of refuge option that people can go for. But like I said earlier, refuge is a very sort of specific kinds of accommodation. And so that's not kind of right for everybody all of the time. But again, these other services can sort of help you to sort of look into that kind of direction as well. And it also depends on where you want to be as well, because in terms of the refuge route as well, that often tends to involve relocating to somewhere else in the country. So if people, we sometimes get people who we would accept for refuge, but they choose not to come to us because, say, they've got a sick mum that they want to be there for, and we're in the wrong part of the country for them, kind of thing, if that makes sense. But also what somebody needs to be thinking about is where it is safe for them to be. So it's also often the case, if you're experiencing abuse, it is not safe for you to remain in the borough that you are in, kind of thing. So sometimes people might need to move a long way away from that place. Other times somebody might want to stay in the same kind of rough area. It's also important to sort of highlight as well, because of that, in terms of domestic abuse, in theory, you can present to a local authority anywhere in the country as a victim of domestic abuse, because of course people that flee domestic abuse have often got somebody that might be pursuing them. So you're not tied to, in terms of housing, you tend to have a local connection in order to apply for housing. That shouldn't apply for survivors of domestic abuse. Does that make sense? I feel like I've gone off on one there.
Absolutely. And I think this is why it's important to recognise that when we talk about trans women being invading domestic abuse shelters, etc., there's no such thing. If you're a trans person or a non-binary person who's in need of these services, you've hit your lowest point. Trans people are not just entering domestic abuse shelters and seeking to use these services because they want to. They need to use these services. And I think you highlight in the report the rapidly changing legal landscape and policy landscape around trans identities in the wake of the Poor Women Scotland ruling and the EHRC guidance. What is also worth pointing out to listeners is that, and I'm not asking Melissa here to make a comment on this, she legally isn't able to, but it's worth pointing out that in the UK, there are certain high-profile domestic abuse services that have explicitly been funded to exclude trans people as a matter of basic principle, out of philosophical principle. And it's like, how do trans people navigate a landscape where there's so much misinformation about what trans people can access? And the reason why I reached out to Melissa to hold this conversation today is I want to explore how we can push back against that misinformation more broadly.
And I think that actually with what you said as well, one thing that really worries me is the way that then trans people are then pushed away from accessing services at all, kind of thing. So, and of course, if you turn on the telly and everyone's telling you you're banned from toilets and whatever, why are you actually going to bother to reach out for services in the first place? And we know that on the back of the Supreme Court judgment, a lot of I heard of lots of trans people that basically stopped going out, kind of thing. And if we feel like we're alienated from services generally, that pushes us for feeling like there is no help out there. Now, obviously, we've talked about how bloody awful a lot of stuff is. But I think that nevertheless it is important to highlight it's not a great situation. We can't sugarcoat it and say that, everything's fine for trans people out there. But there are services out there, and there are services out there that can support you. There is also quite a lot of goodwill around in terms of services. Like I say, we've done a lot of training for different domestic abuse services over time. Now, however much services are being pushed to exclude, there are a lot of services out there that do want to include however they can, kind of thing. So, and I think that specifically with some of the LGBT specific services that I've mentioned, it's not easy, but it is important to reach out if you need support, because people are there who will try and help you. And as well, sometimes as well, that you do, it's one of those things I know that we do as encounter as a service, that, sometimes that you encounter professionals, sort of random cis people from some general services that have just really gone the extra mile for people, or just, are really invested in trying to help people. There are good people out there.
No, I agree. And you raised the point that most services do want to be trans inclusive, but they're being forced to segregate because of fear of being sued. And it's telling that gender critics talk about trans people being a threat, yet in reality, it's the lawfare that they're bringing. And again, I'm not expecting you to expand on this, because you have to navigate this carefully. But you see it with spaces like Nottingham Women's Centre, where they're being targeted for being trans inclusive. And if the most supportive organisations face public outcry, or rather outcry from a very small clique that appears to be public because newspapers are picking up on it, it means smaller organisations like yourself, who are trans inclusive as a basic principle, you're going to face a lot of pushback simply because you're pushing and you're promoting this trans inclusive and pluralistic society, which is very much at odds with the supposed public narratives that are currently being pushed in the UK.
Well, yeah, I think ultimately there needs to be something around services being able to provide services as they feel fit to do. And I think it's about services being confident to, to deliver services to the entire community. Whether anyone likes it or not, trans people exist, and we are a part of society. And of course, as we well know, that we've always been there and we will always be there. And so obviously the question is that, do we accept that trans people need to be able to access services of a comparable quality to the cisgender population? And of course that means services respecting us for who we are. And I think that, I think that services simply need to be able to operate to offer trans people a quality service and be allowed to get on with that.
I agree. And it comes back to the way you were framing identity-based abuse, because in some respects, UK society seems to be perpetuating this notion that trans people have got to exist on society's terms, not their own. And in the report, you lay out certain examples of identity-based abuse, including pressure to engage in therapies that are problematizing or changing identity. And in the NHS, they're potentially going to be embedding that, especially for young trans people, where they're talking about exploratory therapy. It's like, how are we as a society supposed to allow trans people to exist on their own terms when the very support services that they're having to access are saying that you're a problem here, that trans people are a problem that only we can resolve? And that in turn leads to things like creating guilt in the trans person by saying, well, actually, you're causing distress to your loved ones just because you look a particular way or you're acting a particular way. And that is really destructive for trans people's identities.
I think it's not just in fact actually it's not just destructive for trans people. I think the awful thing about it is it's destructive for everyone with what and I've come across situations where a trans people has been told basically, look what you're doing to your mother by perpetuating with this trans nonsense as desperate attempts are underway to stop that person being trans. Now that it ultimately it doesn't obviously it the primary effect is on the trans person, and that's dreadful, but it tears apart families sometimes. Do you know what I mean? And so I think there's a real tragedy in there that in some of these situations where somebody has felt because of what their heads got full of, that they cannot accept their own child because their own child is trans, that person loses their child. Do you know what I mean? So it's, the abusive impact is felt by the trans person, but families are very needlessly sometimes pulled apart just by not being able to accept somebody for who they are. And I think that's an absolute tragedy. And I think that a society that does not recognize that as a huge problem and as something immensely destructive in a completely pointless fashion is there's is failing in a certain respect there. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think you then talk about imposing beliefs about trans identities onto trans individuals. For instance, things like the trans person is going to regret it when they transition, and subjecting trans people to a hostile media environment. Now, not to put too finer a point on it, but that then the whole of British society is potentially leading trans people to view all of society as hostile to trans people. Now, on personal experience, I never experienced abuse in my personal life. Outside of social media, not a single person in my personal life, friends, family, or work colleagues would ever seek to denigrate my identity. So trans people are being subjected to that. That's horrific. I mean, genuinely,
Yeah.
appalling.
I think the really important thing to recognize there is that because again, and the thing is obviously we all if you look at certain newspapers or whatever, it's it's horrific, isn't it? And it can have a potentially really awful effect on your mental health. And I think what's important to appreciate is that just being a trans person in UK society at this moment can be a mental health challenge, particularly if you're quite engaged with media, can't it? So, but the thing is that we do have the choice, if we so wish to or feel able to switch it off for a bit. Do you know what I mean? To withdraw from that a little bit. I think what's really important to recognise is that for some individuals in our communities, they exist in that society and against that backdrop, but they're also having it thrust in their face at home where you can't get away from it. And in terms of that stuff with media, I know of people that have had family members sending them videos about, look at this awful thing about trans people and this is what's going to happen to you. And they kind of get bombarded with stuff sort of continually, and then you can't escape from it. You don't have a respite. It's in your home. It's there with you constantly, as well as kind of being out there in the world. And I think that it makes me think one of the most I still think about this. I've heard people say things like, sort of might be experiencing really quite horrible abuse. I'm, thinking, potentially quite, sort of high-end physical abuse and stuff like that. And then I've had it fed back that, that somebody might have seen something said on the television or something like that about trans people. And it's like, well, this is what the people that run the country think of us. I'm going through this, but this is, so it's also thinking about that effect, that if you're going through all this sort of stuff at home, but then you're also hearing this stuff outside as well, you've got to live with that stuff. But then you're getting this message from society that, well, actually, maybe I do deserve it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great tragedy of it gets internalized. You raise a point about sea lining, basically a consistent questioning of a person's trans identity. with a view to undermining that identity. And I feel, ironically, that certain sections of the media are sea-lining trans people on a daily basis. And
Do you know
this is
that
just drumbeat.
because I think there's a very crude thing that can be done with trans people as well. Because I think if you go to anybody, it's all when we get into all this adult human female business and all this kind of stuff. If you go to anybody, if you went to a cis man, well, what is it to be a man? How do you really know that you're a man? You can, because the thing is that there is actually no, because even if somebody says a woman is an adult human female, well, what exactly constitutes a female? You can start to deconstruct over this. The thing that I always go back to is that, when people always say the what is a woman thing, that's on the question, what is a woman, is on the very first page of the preface of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And it's a question it takes us 750 pages to answer. And I think that, these sort of questions about gender and identity, that if you start sort of bombarding people with questions about it, you can do that to cis people, because these aren't fixed concepts. And the idea of what a man is or a woman is, there's not ever going to be one fixed definition of those things. That's not really possible. There are multiple different views on what a man or a woman might be, and that operates in different contexts. But it's very easy if you've got a vulnerable person to, and this wouldn't necessarily have to be about gender. You could do this people have done this about sexuality, for example, that you can, if you constantly start berating somebody sea-lining them, constantly asking them all these questions, you can undermine anybody about anything, really, if they're a vulnerable person.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel this is a really important point to draw it all together. It's like, if you are experiencing domestic abuse as a trans and non-binary person, Loving Me is a perfect place to find information and to gain information. So do you want to talk a bit about the information you've got available for people and do some signposting so if people need your support and help, they know where to find you?
Right, okay. In terms of accessing us, our website is www.lovingme.uk. We can be contacted on help@lovingme.uk. Helpline number is 07902 478 958. Now, as I said earlier, that because we're just starting to do some outreach work in the Northwest, that's not quite online yet. We've just appointed somebody to that. So we no longer operate an outreach service, but if people get in touch with us, we are happy to do kind of like a one-off chat with people to try and just sort of look at their situation and try and signpost somebody into the right direction. We also would like to hear from people. If people have been experiencing domestic abuse and have been excluded from services, feel free to let us know about that, because we will log that and we will try to raise that through the appropriate channels, because we will try to sort of lobby about that stuff. If somebody is experiencing domestic abuse and needs general outreach support, as mentioned earlier, Galop are a really good organisation to contact. If you're under 25 and need housing support, AKT, the Albert Kennedy Trust. If you live in Cheshire, and contact Trans Without Abuse. Also, it's worth knowing that you can contact Refuge. If you Google the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, Refuge will accommodate trans people in refuge accommodation. Now, in theory, you should be able to contact your local domestic abuse service, and they sort of should help you.
It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. All the information that Melissa just said is going to be posted in the comments below. So if you do need help and support, please check out the information. I will also put a link to the report in the notes for this show as well. So if you'd like to go and read it, it's a very interesting report. There's a lot of useful information here. And by all means, please do take the time to have a read through it, because I think that what Loving Me have done is a really interesting piece of research that is very timely and very important, which is why I wanted to bring Melissa on the show today, because I feel this is a very urgent conversation that needs to be had. So would you like to add anything at the end of the show then?
So if people are experiencing domestic abuse and they feel that they do need refuge, obviously they are free to contact us around that. We do accept self-referrals. The one issue is that we are very often full, as you might imagine. But we will try to signpost people in the right direction if we are full. But it is unfortunate that we do get a lot of people contacting us that we're simply not in a position to help at that time.
Thank you. So it's been an absolute pleasure, Melissa. Thank you for having the chat today. I think it's been very illuminating. Hopefully our listeners will be able to take something away from this. And best of luck with everything going forward. Hopefully you'll secure more funding and more trans people will be able to benefit from your services.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.
Cheers.